The office door explodes inward. Wood splinters like gunfire. A masked man lunges for me, but I swing the crystal award hard, cracking his skull. His cufflink tears free in my grip, silver and engraved with a name I recognize. David Vance. The private investigator I was going to hire tomorrow. My hands shake as I clutch the burner phone, the one piece of evidence that could save me from losing everything in 72 hours. He wasn't here to rob me. He was here to silence me. The mahogany desk in the Greenwich estate felt like a cold altar. Sarah Miller sat hunched over its polished surface, the only light in the room coming from the blue-white glow of her laptop. Outside, the manicured lawns of the estate were swallowed by a thick Connecticut mist. But inside, Sarah was hunting. Her fingers, steady despite the thrumming of her heart, moved with surgical precision as she connected a small black wire from her computer to a burner phone. She had found the device tucked deep inside the lining of Mark's gym bag, hidden beneath the sweat-wicking fabric of his expensive workout gear. The progress bar on her screen crawled forward. Cloning. 34%. Sarah pushed her designer glasses up the bridge of her nose, her thumb tracing the edge of her handheld tally counter in her pocket. Click. One small lie. Mark had told her he was going to the gym to work on his cardio health, but the phone told a different story. She glanced at the digital clock on her desk. 72 hours. That was all the time remaining before their 10th anniversary. If she didn't find proof of his infidelity before the clock struck midnight on Saturday, the sunset clause in their prenuptial agreement would kick in. The multi-million-dollar protection she had fought for would evaporate, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the bitter taste of a wasted decade. The air in the office smelled of expensive sandalwood candles, a scent Mark insisted on. To Sarah, it felt cloying, like the perfume of a funeral parlor. She watched the data stream across her screen. Text logs, GPS coordinates, photos. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a forensic audit of a betrayal. She needed the numbers to match. She needed the input of his lies to equal the output of her freedom. "Come on," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp in the silent room. "Give me the trail." The heavy door to the office creaked open. Sarah didn't jump. She simply closed the laptop lid in one smooth, practiced motion. Jennifer Thompson stepped into the room, her heels clicking like metronome beats on the hardwood floor. Jennifer's hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful, her eyes scanning the room for threats even before she looked at Sarah. "The clock is ticking, Sarah," Jennifer said, her voice a rapid-fire staccato. "I've reviewed the latest filings. Mark's team is move-ready. They're looking for any sign of unstable behavior to invalidate your standing. If we don't have the smoking gun by the anniversary, you're walking away with a handshake and a good luck." Jennifer walked to the window, her fingers twitching. She began humming "Happy Birthday" under her breath. A soft, eerie sound that Sarah knew meant the lawyer was reaching her limit. Jennifer only hummed when she felt the world getting dirty. "I have the data," Sarah said, tapping the closed laptop. "The burner phone was a gold mine. I'm just waiting for the final sync. We have 72 hours to turn this into a legal guillotine." Jennifer turned, her face a mask of professional intensity. "It's not just about the money anymore. If he's using creative financing to hide his tracks, we're looking at a federal level of fraud. This is a minefield, and you're standing right in the center of it with a pair of scissors." Suddenly, the heavy stillness of the house was shattered. A deafening crash echoed from the hallway, the sound of the front door's heavy oak frame splintering under a massive force. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't scream. She lunged for the laptop, shoving it into a desk drawer even as the office door was kicked open. A man, dressed in dark tactical gear with a matte black mask obscuring his face, surged into the room. He didn't look like a burglar. He moved with a terrifying, practiced economy of motion. The air in the room suddenly felt electric, charged with the scent of ozone and cold sweat. The intruder didn't go for the jewelry box on the mantel. He lunged straight for the desk. "Get back!" Jennifer shrieked, throwing a heavy law tome at the man's head. The intruder swiped the book aside and grabbed Sarah by the shoulders. His grip was like iron, the cold fabric of his gloves biting into her skin. Sarah felt a surge of cold, white-hot adrenaline. She reached out, her fingers scrambling across the desk until they closed around a heavy crystal award. A Woman of the Year trophy she had won 3 years ago. She swung. The crystal caught the man on the side of his head with a sickening thud. He groaned, his grip loosening just enough for Sarah to twist away. She scrambled toward the balcony doors, the cold night air rushing in as she threw them open. The intruder recovered instantly, his boots thudding on the carpet as he pursued her. They reached the edge of the stone balcony. Sarah felt the rough masonry against her back, the drop into the darkness of the garden looming behind her. The man reached for her throat, but Sarah was faster. She grabbed his arm, her nails digging into the sleeve of his jacket as she tried to shove him back. In the struggle, her fingers caught on something hard and metallic at his wrist. She yanked with everything she had. A silver object tore free just as the intruder shoved her hard against the railing. He didn't stay to finish the job. He looked back at the desk, saw the empty drawer, and then leaped over the railing, disappearing into the thick Connecticut mist like a ghost. Sarah collapsed onto the stone floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hand was clenched tight. "Sarah, are you hurt?" Jennifer rushed to her side, her face pale in the moonlight. Sarah didn't answer. She opened her hand. Resting in her palm was a silver cufflink, engraved with an intricate swirling pattern. A stylized V intertwined with a compass rose. "He wasn't a thief," Sarah whispered, the metallic tang of fear sharp on her tongue. "He was looking for the phone." She stood up, her legs shaking, and walked back into the office. She held the cufflink under the desk lamp. The light glinted off the polished surface, revealing a small, jagged scratch near the edge. Her mind, always the auditor, began to cross-reference the image. She had seen this design before. She had spent weeks researching the best private investigators in the tri-state area, looking for someone who could bypass Mark's security. Subverted. Sarah stared at the silver cufflink, her mind racing with a sense of grim satisfaction. This was the break she needed. She had spent hours vetting David Vance, a man with a reputation for being a ghost, a professional who could find an offshore account in a hurricane. She had seen this very cufflink in his promotional photos. A family heirloom, he'd called it. This makes perfect sense, she thought, her pulse beginning to steady. Vance must have been scouting the house. He's a professional. He probably saw the intruder or realized I was in danger and tried to intervene in his own aggressive way. Or perhaps he was testing my security before taking the job. It was a logical conclusion. In the world of high-stakes divorce, the best investigators often operated on the edge of legality. If Vance was already here, it meant he was interested. It meant she had the best man for the job already on the premises. She felt a wave of relief wash through her. She wasn't alone in this dark house anymore. She had a guardian, albeit a violent one. "Jennifer, it's okay," Sarah said, her voice regaining its habitual clip. "It's David Vance, the investigator I told you about. He must have been doing a preliminary sweep. It's a bit much, but that's why he's the best. He's already working the case." Jennifer frowned, her eyes darting to the splintered door. That's a hell of a way to introduce yourself, Sarah. It's a message, Sarah insisted, feeling a surge of confidence. He's showing me that Mark's security is a joke. He's showing me he can get in. This is good. We hire him tomorrow, and we end this. She walked toward the window, looking out into the dark woods, expecting to see a reassuring nod from the shadows. She felt smart. She had identified the threat and turned it into an asset. The plan was back on track. Then she noticed a small detail. On the floor, right where the intruder had been standing, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. Sarah picked it up. It wasn't a note or a map. It was a receipt from a high-end locksmith, dated yesterday. The client name field was blacked out, but the address for the service was her own. A cold prickle danced across her skin. If Vance was her guardian, why was he billing someone else for changing the locks on her own home? She turned the cufflink over in her hand. The V didn't stand for Vance. As she held it closer to the light, she saw the tiny, microscopic engraving on the back. It wasn't a compass rose. It was a stylized M. The truth hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. The world tilted, and Sarah had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from falling. Vance hadn't been scouting the house to help her. He hadn't been testing the security for her benefit. The anonymous client who had hired the most dangerous investigator in the state wasn't Sarah. It was Mark. Mark had hired Vance to find the burner phone and destroy the evidence before Sarah could use it. The intruder wasn't a mistake or a test. It was a targeted hit on her legal strategy. By identifying Vance, Sarah hadn't found an ally. She had identified the man who was currently being paid to ensure she lost everything. She had handed her husband's hunter a piece of his own armor, and in doing so, she realized that every move she had planned for tomorrow was already known by the enemy. She was no longer the auditor. She was the one being liquidated. The sound of a car engine purring up the driveway shattered her realization. "He's home," Jennifer whispered, her face pale. Mark Miller entered the house not like a man returning from a long day, but like a conqueror. He was smiling, that porcelain-white, perfect smile that Sarah had once found charming, but now saw as a row of polished teeth in a trap. "Sarah, honey, I'm home." His voice boomed through the foyer, rich and warm. He didn't mention the splintered front door. He didn't seem to notice the glass on the floor. He walked straight into the office and enveloped Sarah in a hug that felt more like a cage. He smelled of rain and expensive gin. "I've had an epiphany," Mark said, pulling back to look her in the eye. He didn't blink. He leaned in, his hand resting on her forearm in that false gesture of intimacy he used to close deals. The hedge fund, the meetings, the constant travel. It's all noise. With our anniversary coming up, I realized what's important. Us. Sarah felt the tally counter in her pocket click. Click, click, pop. Mark cracked his knuckles, thumb, index, pinky. The signal. He was about to tell a massive lie. "I've canceled everything," Mark continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "No phones, no staff, no distractions. For the next 48 hours, we are in monk mode. Just you and me, right here in the estate. A total brand refresh for the Miller marriage." He reached out and gently took Sarah's purse from the desk. He reached inside and pulled out her car keys. "I'll keep these safe," he said, dropping them into his own pocket. "And I've set up a little something to help us truly disconnect." He pulled a small, sleek black box from his jacket and placed it on the mahogany desk. A soft blue light pulsed on its surface. Instantly, the signal bars on Sarah's laptop vanished. The no service icon appeared on her phone. He had activated a high-powered signal jammer. "The landlines are down for maintenance, too," Mark said, his smile never wavering. "It's just us now, superstar. Total isolation. Isn't it romantic?" Sarah felt the walls of the estate closing in. The house, which had once been a symbol of her success, was now a high-priced prison. She was trapped with a man who was likely planning her financial or perhaps physical ruin. And the only man who could help her was the one Mark had hired to hunt her down. The next morning, the house felt like a tomb. The cloying scent of sandalwood was so thick Sarah could taste it. Mark was everywhere, offering her coffee, suggesting they walk the grounds, watching her with those cold, predatory eyes. She managed to slip away to the kitchen under the guise of making tea. She needed to find a way out, a way to reach Jennifer. As she passed the basement door, she heard a faint, pathetic whimper. "Cooper?" she whispered. She pushed the door open. The basement was a cavern of shadows, the air smelling of damp concrete and old boxes. There, huddled in the far corner, was her golden retriever, Cooper. The dog was shivering, his tail tucked between his legs. He had been locked in the dark with no food or water. As Sarah knelt to comfort the dog, a sudden, heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards. She looked up just in time to see the massive, framed wedding portrait that hung at the top of the stairs tear free from the wall. It crashed down the flight of steps, the glass shattering into 1,000 jagged diamonds, the heavy gilded frame missing her head by mere inches. Sarah scrambled back, her heart racing. This wasn't an accident. The wire had been frayed, the dog had been moved. Mark wasn't just waiting for the clock to run out, he was accelerating the timeline. She knew she couldn't stay. She waited until Mark was in his glass-walled gym, his back to the house as he ran on the treadmill. She crept to the pantry, a narrow room with a single, high window that led to the wooded perimeter of the property. It was a tight squeeze, the cold metal of the window frame biting into her shoulders as she wiggled through. She tumbled onto the damp mulch outside, the smell of wet earth and pine needles filling her lungs. She didn't stop to breathe. She ran for the tree line, her feet pounding on the soft ground. She hadn't gone 50 yards when a hand shot out from behind a towering oak tree and clamped over her mouth. Sarah struggled, her elbows flying, but she was pulled back into the deep shadows of the woods. "Quiet," a voice grated. It was like gravel under a boot. She was spun around. Standing before her was the man from the office, David Vance. Up close, his face was a map of scars and weariness. He wasn't wearing the mask now. He stood exactly 4 feet away from her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "You're a hard woman to protect, Mrs. Miller," Vance said, his voice sounding distant, as if he were speaking from across a canyon. "Protect?" Sarah spat, her voice a low hiss. "You were in my house. You tried to take the phone. Mark hired you." Vance's eyes darted to the house, then back to her. "Mark didn't hire me. He thinks he did. But I don't work for men who crack their knuckles before they lie." Before Sarah could respond, the roar of an engine shattered the silence of the woods. A dark SUV, its headlights off, swerved off the main driveway and tore across the lawn, heading straight for the tree line where they stood. "Run!" Vance yelled. They bolted deeper into the woods, the branches whipping against Sarah's face, the smell of scorched rubber and exhaust fumes trailing them. The SUV didn't slow down. It crashed through the underbrush, the heavy grille snapping saplings like toothpicks. Sarah's lungs burned. The world was a blur of dark trunks and silver moonlight. They reached a low stone wall at the edge of the property. Vance grabbed her by the waist and practically threw her over the stones just as the SUV roared past, its tires spinning in the mud, missing the wall by a hair's breadth. The vehicle didn't turn back. It sped away toward the back gate, its taillights disappearing into the mist. Sarah lay on the cold, wet leaves, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Vance stood over her, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "Who was that?" Sarah gasped. "Not Mark," Vance said, his voice tight. "Mark wants you alive until the anniversary. He needs the erratic behavior narrative to hold up in court. That was someone who wants you dead now." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, laminated sheet of paper. It was a copy of a life insurance policy. "Mark took this out 6 months ago," Vance said, tossing it to her. $5 million. It pays out double if you die in an accidental tragedy before the 10th anniversary. If you die, he doesn't need the prenup to expire. He gets everything, and he gets it tax-free. Sarah looked at the document, the numbers blurring before her eyes. The auditor in her finally saw the full ledger. Mark hadn't just been planning to leave her, he had been planning to liquidate her. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, looking up at Vance. Vance reached into his wallet and touched a worn slip of paper, a grocery list, yellowed with age. "Because I know what happens when you're too late to stop a man like that. Now get up. We have 6 hours left, and we're going to Manhattan." The drive to the city was a blur of rain and silence. They followed Mark's silver sedan from a distance, watching as he navigated the slick streets of Soho. He pulled up to a nondescript, high-security residential club, a place where the elite went to disappear. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of Vance's rugged truck, her thumb clicking the tally counter in her pocket. Click, click, click. "He's going to meet her," Sarah said, her voice cold. "The architect, the one from the burner phone." Vance checked his watch. "The front gate is a fortress. I'll create a distraction. You use the service entrance in the alley. It's a straight shot to the penthouse elevators." Sarah nodded. She felt a strange, icy calm. She was no longer the victim. She was the investigator. As Vance drove to the front of the building and began a loud, physical altercation with the gate guards, Sarah slipped into the shadows of the alley. The service door was heavy steel, but she had the code. She had seen it in the metadata of the burner phone's photos. She slipped inside. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and stale grease. She made it to the service elevator, but as the doors began to close, a massive hand jammed into the gap. The doors hissed open. Standing there was Robert Evans, Mark's head of security. He was a mountain of a man, his eyes darting to the ceiling tiles as he counted them in a silent, rhythmic sequence. "Mrs. Miller?" he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're off limits." He stepped into the small elevator, his presence swallowing the air. Sarah didn't back down. As the lift began to rise, Evans reached for her. Sarah didn't try to out-muscle him. She lunged for the control panel, her fingers flying over the buttons. She slammed her fist into the emergency stop and the Phase 2 override, a trick she'd learned from a building inspector during a charity gala. The elevator screeched to a halt, the sudden deceleration throwing Evans off balance. Sarah grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from his belt and swung it with everything she had, catching him in the solar plexus. As he gasped for air, she jammed the light into the door track, locking the lift between floors. She scrambled through the emergency hatch in the ceiling, her hands slipping on the cold grease of the cables. She climbed, her muscles screaming, until she reached the top floor. She stepped out into the hallway of the penthouse. It was silent, the plush carpet muffling her footsteps. She reached Suite 502. This was it. The smoking gun. She pulled out her camera, her finger trembling on the shutter. She took a deep breath, kicked the door open, and surged into the room. "Got you," she cried. Subverted. The room was bathed in a soft, golden light from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Sarah stood in the center of the foyer, her camera raised, her heart hammering a triumphant rhythm against her ribs. She could already see the headlines, already feel the weight of the settlement check in her hand. This was the smart play. She had followed the data, bypassed the security, and cornered the predator in his den. She felt a surge of pure, unadulterated relief. The 72 hours of terror were over. She had won. "Mark, it's over," she shouted, her voice echoing in the suite. But there was no movement from the bedroom, no panicked rustle of sheets. Sarah frowned, her camera dipping slightly. She walked further into the room. The suite was impeccably decorated, but it felt sterile. There were no clothes on the floor, no scent of perfume. Then she saw it. In the center of the living room, mounted on a professional-grade tripod, was a high-definition camera. It was pointed directly at the front door, directly at her. A small red light on the camera blinked. Recording. Sarah's phone, the cloned burner, suddenly vibrated in her pocket. A notification appeared. Incoming video call. She swiped the screen. Mark's face appeared, sharp and clear. He wasn't in a bedroom. He was sitting in a well-lit office, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking perfectly calm. "Hello, superstar," Mark said, his voice smooth as silk. "I figured you'd make it here by 11:15. You were always so predictable when it came to the truth." Sarah looked at the camera on the tripod, then back at her phone. "Where are you, Mark? Where is she?" Mark chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "There is no she, Sarah. Not in that room, anyway." "The burner phone? I planted that in my gym bag 3 weeks ago. I knew you'd find it. I knew you'd clone it. Every text from the architect, every GPS coordinate. It was all a curated trail, designed just for you." Sarah felt the floor beneath her feet turn to liquid. "What are you talking about?" "Look around, Sarah," Mark said, leaning into the camera. "You've just broken into a private, high-security club using a stolen service code. You've assaulted a security guard. And right now, the camera in front of you is streaming your erratic, home-invasive behavior directly to my legal team and the NYPD. Outside, the first faint wail of a police siren drifted up from the street. "You wanted a smoking gun, Sarah," Mark whispered, his eyes cold and predatory. "But you're the one holding it. By the time the police process you, it'll be midnight. The anniversary will pass. The prenup will expire. And thanks to this little breakdown of yours, I'll have all the evidence I need to prove you're a danger to yourself and my assets. You didn't catch me, honey. You just walked into your own liquidation." The phone went dead. Sarah stood in the empty, beautiful room, the flashing red light of the tripod camera mocking her. She had been so sure of her data, so confident in her audit, that she hadn't realized she was the only variable Mark had been calculating all along. She wasn't the hunter. She was the inventory, and she had just been marked for disposal. The sirens were closer now, the blue and red lights reflecting off the glass walls of the penthouse. Sarah stood paralyzed, the weight of her failure crushing the air from her lungs. She had lost. Everything she had fought for, her security, her future, her pride, was evaporating in the cold Manhattan night. Then, her eyes caught a small, flickering light in the corner of the room. It was the Wi-Fi router for the suite. its status lights dancing in a rhythmic pattern. The auditor in her, the woman who had spent a lifetime finding the hidden line item, suddenly kicked into gear. Mark was smart, but he was arrogant. He thought he had controlled the narrative, but he had left the network open. Sarah lunged for her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keys. She didn't look for Mark's location. She looked for the data traffic. If Mark was streaming this video, he had to be connected to the building's internal hub. She bypassed the club's basic encryption. It was a standard corporate setup, the kind she had audited 1,000 times. She slid into the internal security feed. She didn't see Mark, but she saw the architect. The data trail didn't lead to this suite. It led to the penthouse directly above, the one owned by Michael Harrison, Mark's billionaire business partner. Sarah's heart leaped. She didn't have time for the stairs. She looked at the ventilation grate in the ceiling. It was wide, designed for the massive HVAC systems of a luxury skyscraper. She remembered a charity escape room event Mark had mocked her for taking too seriously. She knew how these ducts were routed. She scrambled onto a chair, tore the grate free, and hauled herself into the dark, metallic tunnel. The air was cold and smelled of dust and machinery. She crawled, her knees scraping against the tin, until she reached the vent overlooking the penthouse above. She looked down. There, in a room filled with legal ledgers and open laptops, was Mark. But he wasn't alone. He was sitting on a plush velvet sofa with Chloe Harrison, Michael's wife. They weren't just having an affair. They were surrounded by documents showing the systematic embezzlement of Michael's firm. Millions of dollars being diverted into offshore accounts in Chloe's name. Mark wasn't just cheating on Sarah. He was conspiring to ruin his partner and flee the country with a new fortune. Sarah pulled out her phone. She didn't call the police. She didn't call Jennifer. She called Michael Harrison. "Michael," she whispered into the phone as she recorded the scene below. "I think you should check the security feed for your penthouse. Right now." The explosion was silent but total. Below her, the door to the penthouse was thrown open not by the police, but by Michael Harrison himself. Followed by a team of federal investigators he had apparently kept on speed dial. Mark's face went from triumphant to ashen in a matter of seconds. Chloe shrieked, clutching a ledger to her chest as if it could protect her. Sarah watched as the man who had tried to liquidate her was led away in handcuffs, his porcelain-white smile finally shattered. As the sun began to rise over the Manhattan skyline, Sarah walked out of the residential club. The air was crisp and clean, the smell of the city, pretzel salt and exhaust, feeling like the scent of freedom. 6 months later, Sarah sat on the stoop of her new Boston brownstone. The neighborhood was quiet, the trees just beginning to turn gold with the arrival of autumn. She sipped her coffee, the warmth of the ceramic mug seeping into her palms. She looked at her wrists. They were bare. No expensive jewelry, no heavy watches. She had sold the Greenwich estate, the cars, the perfect life. David Vance walked up the sidewalk, his rugged face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. He stood 4 feet away, as always. "The final settlement cleared this morning," he said, his voice no longer sounding so distant. "You're officially a very wealthy, very free woman, Sarah." Sarah nodded. She looked at the tally counter in her pocket, then pulled it out and set it on the stone step. "I don't think I'll be needing that anymore," she said. She looked out at the street, at the people walking their dogs and the children playing in the park. For the first time in 10 years, she wasn't looking for a lie. She wasn't auditing the world. She was just living in it. The silence of the morning wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. Sarah Miller took a deep breath. the cool Boston air filling her lungs. And finally, she was home.